Well, thank you for joining us again as we continue our study of the Gospel of Matthew. We are continuing to go through the Gospel, picking up in chapter 14 today. If it's your first time joining us, you might go back and start at the beginning. We began in chapter 1 at the beginning of July, and we're just going through the Gospel of Matthew, trying to emphasize the things about Jesus that Matthew emphasizes, understand really the message about Jesus that he wants us to understand. A lot of themes that we're trying to draw out and so forth. And so appreciate you joining us. Appreciate these guys joining us. Jason Strickland and Todd Taylor and Garrett Horn are with us today. And so we're thankful for their participation. Well, coming into chapter 14, then we're picking up back in the narrative. In chapter 13, Jesus went into a series of parables talking about what the kingdom is all about. A couple of chapters ago, in chapter 11, you might recall that John the Baptist came up, and he was curious, had some questions about confidence and building confidence for himself, maybe for just his disciples. But he sent those disciples to Jesus and received some affirmation about who Jesus is based on the works that he was performing. Well, we're coming back to the subject of John the Baptist. We're sort of finding out what happened to him, and then we're seeing Herod's response to all of that. Well, Matthew chapter 14, it tells us that at that time Herod the Tetrarch heard the report about Jesus. And we're going to get to what he thinks about those reports in just a moment. But very briefly, let's skip over verse 2 and talk about what had happened to John the Baptist. It says in verse 3, "For Herod had laid hold of John and bound him and put him in prison for the sake of Herodias, his brother Philip's wife, because John had said to him, 'It is not lawful for you to have her.' And although he wanted to put him to death, he feared the multitude, because they had counted him as a prophet. But when Herod's birthday was celebrated, the daughter of Herodias danced before them and pleased Herod. Therefore he promised with an oath to give her whatever she might ask. So she, having been prompted by her mother, said, 'Give me John the Baptist's head on a platter.' And the king was sorry. Nevertheless, because of the oaths and because of those who sat with him, he commanded it to be given to her. So he sent and had John beheaded in prison. And his head was brought on a platter and given to the girl, and she brought it to her mother. And his disciples came and took away the body and buried it. And they went and told Jesus." Well, that is a very sorrowful end to the life of John the Baptist. We're told about this in retrospect. As Matthew's going through, this has already happened. Remember, when he sent his disciples to Jesus, he was in prison. So this is sort of backing up and saying, here's what happened to John the Baptist. But it's interesting that that's given to us in the context of Herod hearing about Jesus. Because what does Herod think when he hears about the works of Jesus, Garrett?
Yeah, so he thinks that it's John the Baptist risen from the dead. And it shows that Herod thought that John was a holy and righteous man. We learn about this in Mark chapter 6, verse 20. Mark provides that detail to us that he actually thought that John the Baptist was holy and righteous and enjoyed listening to him and didn't want to have him put to death, but of course as Matthew told us, made the kind of the rash promise to Herodias that he would give her whatever she wanted. And so perhaps there's a little bit of guilt in the back of Herod's mind here when he hears about this man doing these things. It's John the Baptist come back. This holy man has come back. But it does show that Herod thought that John was a righteous man.
Yeah, and I mean, you think about it, maybe there's wishful thinking that it's John the Baptist come back, or maybe it's fear. But it falls into a pattern of leadership that we see through the gospel of men who are affected by Jesus and now by John the Baptist, but who are too cowardly to follow their convictions. to follow the impressions that they get, whether it be of Jesus or here of John the Baptist. And it's interesting that the gospel writers lay that out for us, whether here with Herod or later we'll see with Pilate, that they show us the apprehensions of men like this. That this is not just a man who goes after Jesus because of his tyranny, but really because of his cowardice. And the same thing, of course, will be true with Pilate as we get over to there. But as you say, that righteous man, I mean, if you heard about somebody, what would it take for you to think, oh, that's somebody that's raised from the dead? I mean, you'd really have to be impressed with that person. And so Herod is genuinely impressed with John the Baptist. But what that also says, going back to the subject of cowardice, is that he could be so impressed with John the Baptist that he thinks he can be raised from the dead, and yet not impressed enough to overcome his cowardice. So that is a particular level of dereliction of duty, if you will. And today, sometimes we wonder about people who are at a crossroads with Jesus and saying, if they could only see. Look, those competing tensions of what we ought to do versus the other surrounding pressures, whether it be the family pressure here or really social pressure, because it says not only because of the oath that he had made, those who are surrounding him. And so there's social pressure, and that overwhelmed the clear understanding that he had of how important John the Baptist was. So let us not fool ourselves into thinking that if only us or our friends could see miracles, that would surely overwhelm the competing pressures of this world. No, the competing pressures of this world overwhelmed people who saw these things firsthand. Well, picking up in verse 13, we continue with the story. Jesus heard about this, and so he departed from there by boat to a deserted place by himself. Let me pause right there before we get into our next question. This is not an infrequent occurrence that Jesus goes away to have some time to himself. And we find that he does that to be in prayer. We find that here, I think, to have a time of sorrow, a time of grief to himself. One of the things, though, that very frequently follows that is the next words, the multitudes heard and they followed. He goes and finds time to himself, but he rarely gets to keep that time to himself because Jesus came here to do particular work. So the multitudes come, and they followed him on foot from the cities. And when Jesus went out and saw the great multitude, he was moved with compassion for them, and he healed their sick. Well, as the day wears on, there is the concern of food. And the disciples, they have one solution, and Jesus gives another solution. Jason, is this your question?
It is.
All right. Well, tell us about the disciples' response, and then what's Jesus' response?
Well, their basic response is, we don't have enough food here, and we can look at the other accounts of the Gospels to get some other information and some different details. And I think it's interesting that, if I'm not mistaken, this is the only miracle that's actually recorded in all four Gospels. And so if you take those different accounts, which are written to different audiences, so you get different details for that reason. The other accounts that are found in Mark 6, Luke 9, and John 6, you find these different details, and the apostles there said, well, we don't have enough food for these people. We're in a desolate place, and it's getting late, so you'll need to send them out to back to the villages to find food. And but Jesus' basic short answer here was, well, you feed them. Even though we don't have the food or we don't have it, he says, you feed them. And it's interesting to me that they didn't quite understand when he said it, And so, as you already alluded to, Jesus had withdrew himself before this. And from the other details that we find from the other four accounts, the 12 were with him. And I think just a couple of things with this, it's interesting to me as I went through this, from reading all four accounts of this, that uh, when Jesus um, does go off to himself, but from the other accounts, the 12 also were with him, and he tells them in Mark's account to go away by themselves with them and rest. They had just come. The 12 had just come back from a highly successful ministry. They were telling him the things that they had done and then they had taught. And you mentioned that he wanted to have some time to himself because John was just killed for grief and things. He was wanting to reflect on the things also maybe that they had were just telling him. If I'm not mistaken, also he had been Jesus himself been teaching for at least 2 years at this time, if not more. And so his popularity is also rising. So these crowds are are coming. So as you mentioned, it's difficult for him to find these times to be alone. I think it shows in his wanting to be alone, no doubt of human feelings, the grief that he was showing, that he has these feelings. Also, maybe the thought of um, the things that the 12 were telling him. Um, I kind of think maybe I don't have much to put this on, but I think maybe it's plausible. The area where they went to, if my geography as understanding is right, is also out of Herod's jurisdiction. So was it plausible that he was going to a safer place? Maybe. I mean, I said I don't have much to back that up on, but I believe that geography is right. But irregardless, the crowds followed. They followed. I think it's interesting. They ran around on foot. They were in a boat. They ran and beat them to the other side on foot to get to where he was. And in Mark's account, it says that Jesus has compassion on them as they were as sheep without a shepherd. And so he begins to heal and teach them. And again, we come back to the point of this is they were in this desolate place, and he told them to you feed them. And again, the couple of points as I wrap this up is they didn't they didn't understand how this could be done, but they cheerfully obeyed. They did exactly what he said, even though in John's account the disciple said 200 denarii of bread couldn't feed the crowd, and but Jesus says 5 loaves and 2 fish can, and that's how he fed the crowd. And one other point. Um, Jesus blessed the food. And I think with this large crowd, he looks up to heaven and he blesses the food. You kind of, to give the large crowd almost a scene of what he's doing, to understand what he's doing. It's to me, is a good example for us of why we give thanks. We give thanks because Jesus is this example. We give thanks for our food. We give thanks for our meals. And lastly, Christ is the bread of life, and he satisfies our hunger for our soul, for forgiveness, our desire for heaven and knowledge. And he gives this bread to his disciples, and he bids them to distribute it to the multitudes. And I think that's us today. We're the ones who gives the bread of life to those who we strive to teach.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, he takes that 5 loaves and 2 fishes. One of the interesting things is you do combine all of those accounts. Here, Matthew doesn't mention where the 5 loaves and 2 fishes come from. Incidentally, if you are looking through some children's material, you'll generally find this miracle being referenced, and a little boy shares his lunch.
Mm-hmm.
Matthew doesn't even share the little boy. He didn't even tell us about it because that's not the point. And I think that is particularly illustrated in the leftovers that are gathered. Todd, why do you suppose we're told about the leftovers? So how much did they gather, and why do you think that information is included?
Okay, well, there were 12 baskets full that were left over. And from my research, these baskets would have been small wicker baskets to carry food. So, a lot of times I, in the past, would have thought much bigger baskets, but small wicker baskets carry food, and there were 12 of them. I don't know for sure why Matthew tells us about this. He doesn't tell us why he tells us, but I have maybe a couple of ideas. One, there are 12 baskets. You have the 12 apostles. When Jesus told them to, feed the crowd, and I think over in John 6, it says that he said these things to them, especially Philip at that time, to test them. And, they had been on the limited commission, and they weren't supposed to take food with them. They were supposed to rely on God. And here was another time to kind of test their faith on this. And you go back to chapter 13, you go through chapter 14 and into chapter 15, and you have different levels of faith exhibited by different people. And I think this is something to help them with their faith. Each of them has an object lesson, essentially, carrying around a basket full of food. And, they couldn't give the food to these people, but God could provide, and Jesus could provide. And they would have something to help them to increase their faith, I guess.
Yeah, I do think there's a notion that of the 12 being significant. And can you imagine each one of them holding a basket and Jesus just looking at them like, well, what did you learn the lesson? And incidentally, no, they didn't, because John's account will tell us that they're still not sure what to do with the crowd and how to feed them later on. Well, another thing that I would take there is just the overwhelming power of Jesus being displayed here, right? Incidentally, like if you're looking at Calvinism, one of the arguments that they'll make is that God is not wasteful, that God is efficient. And so limited atonement, Jesus' blood would not be shed for those, it wouldn't be shed in a way that it would be for those for whom it is not applicable. So he wouldn't shed more blood than he had to, or something of that sort. Well, there's just an illustration. That's just not true. God does, in love for his people, God consistently overdoes. He goes beyond. We see this time and again that God goes beyond what we need and lavishes on his people. And so here's just another illustration of that. It's not Jesus saying, I think I can probably manage just enough. Maybe we can just stretch it enough. And also, it's not that everybody got a little pinch, but everybody was full, and there's leftovers on the ground that they're able to pick up. And so to make clear to us and to the disciples, Jesus didn't just stretch it really thin so everybody was able to get a little bit of sustenance. No, it was so much that people were leaving food laying around. And so it just, again, the point of the miracle is the overwhelming power of Jesus. Well, after this, then Jesus tells his disciples to go on into the water. He tells he tells the people to he sends them away, and then we're told that that he went up onto the mountain. And so it's as if his time is interrupted. He responds to that interruption compassionately, but he still needs this time. And so he goes back up to the mountain for a time to pray. And it says when evening came, he was alone there. And so he got it. He did find that time. And that's one thing I don't want to overlook, because we do so often see that alone time interrupted. It's not as if Jesus goes, oh, well, I can't have. No, he still goes and seeks it. Time and again, he goes and seeks it. And so he finds that time on this occasion. Well, it says the boat was in the middle of the sea, and it was tossed by the waves, for the wind was contrary. Now in the fourth watch of the night, Jesus went to them walking on the sea. And when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were troubled, saying, it is a ghost. And they cried out for fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them, saying, be of good cheer. It is I. Do not be afraid. And Peter answered him and said, Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water. So he said, come. And when Peter had come out of the boat, he walked on the water to go to Jesus. But when he saw that the wind was boisterous, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, he cried out, saying, Lord, save me. Well, Garrett, it doesn't say precisely why Peter was capable of walking on the water, but I think we can infer some things. Why do you think, what made Peter capable of this miracle?
Well, Peter was able to walk on the water through faith in Jesus, by having faith in Jesus. And we see him, I guess, in typical Peter fashion at first being really, excited about it. It says, if it's you, bid me to come out. So Jesus does. He gets out of the boat. That took faith to do that with the storm going on. And as long as he kept his focus on Jesus, he was able to walk on the water. But as soon as his mind wanders, I guess, and he looks at the wind and the waves, he begins to sink. And of course, he panics and asks Jesus to save him. So as long as he kept his faith in Jesus, he was able to walk on the water. And so, of course, I think there's a lesson for us in this as well. If we keep our spiritual focus on Jesus, we're not going to sink. But if we get distracted by life's trials and lose our focus, we will begin to sink. And so this is a true story, but there's a spiritual application for us there.
Absolutely. And along those lines, Jason, Garrett's already talked a little bit about what made him sink, but thinking about that, what is Jesus's response to that?
Well, he said, "You of little faith, why did you doubt?" And I think that exemplifies Peter here. What he did exemplify his faith. It exemplified his doubt to me, and it makes me think of Matthew 6:33. Seek first the kingdom of God. I mean, and Garrett's already alluded to that, of putting our faith and our trust in God first. And if we don't fail, we don't sink, no matter what the storms of life, if you will, bring. It makes me think of the song we sing, "It Is Well With My Soul." We know the story, most of us do, behind the writing of that song and the trials that he was facing when he wrote the song. So in a lot of the words, from that song, part of the first verse, when sorrows like sea billows roll, whatever my lot, thou hast taught me to say, it is well with my soul. So put our faith and trust in God. And a couple other things to go along with it. I think it's interesting when we think about the things that are taught as far as the miraculous powers and the things of the apostles that are taught throughout the Gospels and other parts of Scripture. When we're taught about their failures, there's times where the apostles failed to be able to do something. And the people that say that Scripture, the Bible, is fake, it's a myth, what book of myths or fables would tell you about failures? What they wouldn't tell you about the apostles being able to fail, would be able to tell you about those type things. But at the same time, in this true book, we're always told why they failed. And those failures are an example for us. So to me, this story and a lot of the others helps me understand and realize this is true. A book of myths is not going to tell you. It's going to tell you the good stuff, not the failures.
Yeah. And I think, like in many cases, what we have is some success and some failure. We have a willingness. Peter's the only one willing to get out on the water, and yet it is not a sustained faith. And I'm reminded of so many characters who give us the good example, and then also the example of failure. And yet Peter, in the end, gives us the example of one who consistently gets back up from his failures, as with so many other heroes. I do appreciate that point of the credibility of being able to reveal the flaws in the heroes that we're reading about. Well, we come then to the end of the chapter there. It says, when they'd crossed over, they came to the land of Gennesaret. And when the men of that place recognized him, they sent out into all the surrounding region, brought to him all who were sick, and begged him that they might only touch the hem of his garment. And as many as touched it were made perfectly well. Well, coming into chapter 15 then, it says, the scribes and the Pharisees who were from Jerusalem came to Jesus saying, why do your disciples transgress the tradition of the elders? For they do not wash their hands when they eat bread. What is the nature of that accusation, Todd?
Well, this was a tradition of the elders of washing their hands. From what my research has dug into some of this, it may well be that this was something that was kind of like a ceremonially ritualistic type of washing. There are some of the Jewish writings from some of the rabbis that talk about some of this, washing twice their hands up to the wrists and things of that nature. But it may well be a kind of a use of the priestly ritualistic washings, and then saying, "Oh, but this is something that regular people need to do as well." And so they are taking things that were not in the law of Moses and trying to apply this to other people and say, "Hey, this is as important, maybe even more important than some of the things that are written in the law of God." And so, and I think that's what gets under Jesus' skin, because they are trying to say, "Oh, we're making the rules now. Listen to what we have to say." And if it's in the law of Moses, well, sometimes we can work around some of that, and we see that in other places.
Yes, absolutely. It is interesting. I mean, that they're just upfront on this occasion. They're not even suggesting that they're breaking the law of God. They're just out there. Why do you not follow our traditions? And of course, that's what we're going to see Jesus address. Garrett, how does Jesus turn that accusation back around on them?
Yeah, so he kind of turns it back on them, and he kind of steps it up a notch. He said, they ask him, why ask them, why do you not follow the tradition of the elders? And Jesus says, why do you transgress the commandment of God with your tradition? So which is worse, to transgress the elders or to transgress God? That's what Jesus asked them. And then he gives them another example of how they've done this with honoring your father and mother. And they said, what they were saying was basically, you could shirk the responsibility of your parents as long as, what would if you tell your parents what I would have given you would have gone to God? Well, that's in direct violation of what the commandment was, and yet they were placing their tradition over what God had actually commanded them to do. And so then he quotes the prophet Isaiah and applies it to them. He talks about how they draw near to God with their lips, but their heart was far from God, and they worship God in vain. And so he just completely takes them down and shows them what's important. Your traditions, if they're in violation of God's law, they don't mean anything, and they show that you're worshiping God in vain.
Yeah, absolutely. And the example particularly that he uses, it's helpful in a couple of ways. First of all, it shows us a way in which they had taken a specific thing that God gives. Here, do this. And they had specifically said, you don't have to do this, and their tradition ends up at a higher priority. Let me say one word. Traditions are not a problem. But when traditions take precedent over what God says, then they become a problem. Traditions are valuable. If we didn't have traditions, then every generation would have to learn all the things from scratch over and over again. We are all standing on things learned by our ancestors, our forefathers, that we benefit greatly from. And so And so we don't want to just throw out traditions, but what we want to do is be willing to toss any tradition to the side if we find that God's word is in conflict with that tradition. But another thing that I would just point out here is I think there's something helpful to this instruction here. We talk about honoring our fathers and our mothers, and we specifically speak of that most often when we're still in the home, when we're still under the care of our fathers and mothers, and obedience is coupled with that honor, that's part of the honor. But then when we form our own households, we leave our father and mothers, and the word there is forsake or abandon, and of course that is using language that means we're separating ourselves from that household and we're forming a new household. And yet this seems to indicate to us the nature of the honor that is ongoing, that you would take care of. Because here he's speaking specifically in those terms, that you get money, there's money that you ought to be using to take care of your parents, and you use it in another way, and then he couples that, the taking care of your parents, with the honor that you ought to be showing your parents. And so that relationship changes, and I just think that that's a valuable thing that Jesus sort of defines, at least in one sense, in one way, the nature of the honor that you show towards your parents. That is, they have taken care of you, and then that role changes around, and there comes a time where it's time for you to take care of them. And so I think, as a side note, that's a helpful thing to pay attention to there. Well, he goes on to say that it is not what goes into the mouth that defiles a man, but what comes out of the mouth that defiles a man. This in conjunction with the instruction of washing the hands. And so what do you think the point of all of this is with regards to washing the hands? Are we to come away with the notion that washing hands is a thing we should avoid, Jason?
No, I think the point of what he's getting at here is basically eating with unwashed hands is not what defiles the man. As already talked about, the Pharisees was more concerned with the ceremonial issues of washing of hands. He says in verse 17, "Do you not understand that everything that goes into the mouth passes into the stomach and is eliminated?" I mean, I can remember growing up being told many times about things. You'll eat a speck of dirt before you die. And that was said many times in relation to various things. I mean, we, as a family, went camping many times. We still do as a family. I mean, hunting and fishing and things like that. And so various times it's hard to be able to have a good way to clean your hands before you eat. And I said that phrase was uttered many times growing up. But as I said, the Pharisees here, they were concerned with the ceremonial of washing of hands and the traditions, and instead of the weightier matters, is that we can refer to from Matthew 23. This wasn't a concern of dirty hands, per se, before a meal. In Matthew 23, he says in verse 23, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, you hypocrites, for you tithe mint and dill and cumin, and have neglected the weightier matters and provisions of the law, justice, mercy, faithfulness. But these are the things that you should have done without neglecting the others. You blind guides who strain at a gnat and swallow a camel." So, these were the things that they were concerned about with the ceremonial stuff. But it kind of also reminds me of the things back from chapter 5 where Jesus had the you have heard it said, but I say to you statements. But what he's talking about here is what defiles a man is what comes from the heart. And if you look at Mark's account in Mark chapter 7, the account goes from verses 1 through 23, but starting in verse 18, he said to them, "Are you so lacking in understanding?" Also talking to the apostles there who explain this to them. "Do you not understand that whatever goes into a man from outside cannot defile him, because it does not go into his heart, but into his stomach and is eliminated? and he was saying that which proceeds from out of the man is what defiles the man. From within, out of the heart of men, proceed evil thoughts, fornications, thefts, murders, adulteries, deeds of coveting, wickedness, as well as deceit, sensuality, envy, slander, pride, and foolishness. All of these things that proceed from within and defile the man. So it's what comes from the heart, what comes out is what defiles the man. Um, it, we've heard a lot of times what we put into our hearts and what we put into our minds is what we're going to get out. Um, heard many times garbage in, garbage out. And so we have to constantly think of what we put in front of ourselves, what we watch on television, what we listen to, what we watch with computers, what our children do, reads, and things like that. And whatever we put in is what we're going to get out. So if we're going to put garbage in, that's what's going to produce out of our heart, what's going to produce out of our mouth. If it's good in, if we study and learn, that's what's going to be produced.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, yeah, again, just to kind of sum up there, wash your hands by all means, but don't think that that's the moral question. And I think so often that's the point with the Pharisees. It's not that everything that they thought you should do were bad things. It's that so often they miss the attitude, the picture of the attitude. And here are people who, for the sake of sanitation, would condemn their brethren, and because they were not as and probably not even sanitation, as Todd pointed out, probably that ceremonial. Oh, you've been around Gentiles, and then didn't come in here and wash your hands, and so maybe they didn't make the self-righteous statement that the Pharisees would have wanted them to make. All the while, they're missing how corroded their hearts are. Well, we come on down then after that exchange. It says the disciples came to him after he'd said that. They said, "Do you know that the Pharisees were offended when they heard this saying?" And I find that a comical question. It's like, don't you know you're going to offend? And it's can you imagine Jesus going, "Yeah, that's why I said it." That's kind of the point, is to put them on notice. Every plant, he says, which my heavenly Father has not planted will be uprooted. Let them alone. They are blind leaders of the blind. And if the blind leads the blind, both will fall into a ditch. Then Peter answered and said to him, "Explain this parable to us." And he said, Are you also still without understanding? Do you not yet understand that whatever enters the mouth goes into the stomach is eliminated, as Jason pointed out? Those things which proceed out of the mouth and from the heart, and they defile a man. For out of the heart proceeds the evil thoughts, murders, adulteries, and fornications, thefts, false witness, blasphemies. These are the things which defile a man. But to eat with unwashed hands does not defile a man. So, coming on then, it says, Jesus went out from there and departed to the region of Tyre and Sidon. Behold, a woman of Canaan came from that region and cried out to him, saying, "Have mercy on me, O Lord, Son of David. My daughter is severely demon-possessed." But he answered her not a word. And his disciples came and urged him, saying, "Send her away, for she cries out after us." But he answered and said, I was not sent except to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. And then she came and worshipped him, saying, "Lord, help me." But he answered and said, "It is not good to take the children's bread and throw it to the little dogs." And she said, "Yes, Lord. Yet even the little dogs eat the crumbs which fall from their master's table." Then Jesus answered and said to her, "O woman, great is your faith, and let it be as you desire." And her daughter was healed from that very hour. It is a fascinating story to me. Todd, what are some takeaways from that exchange?
We could probably spend a whole day talking about this one.
Yeah.
First of all, with her being a Canaanite woman, a Syrophoenician, I think another account talks about it. Matthew is talking basically to a Jewish audience, right? Emphasizing the kingship of Jesus, and we do see that here as well. But he's king of Jew and Gentile, and I think that's starting off, maybe that's one of the things we can see as we go through this story. But the the Syrophoenician woman reminds me of the Samaritan woman. Jesus is talking to someone who's not a Jewish woman, and there's something to be said for that as well. That Jesus, with his interaction with those who were not Jews, but of course he was sent to the Jewish nation, and I find it fascinating. She is calling after Jesus, and she's using terminology that is messianic. She's calling him Lord, and she's calling him Son of David. And so she's not from Israel, and yet she's already recognizing him as the Messiah, and that's very interesting. And yet Jesus says nothing when she's saying this. I mean we think about prayer when we talk to God and how He answers prayer, but He doesn't say anything to this woman who's desperately wanting His help, and then she keeps on crying after him, and the disciples have to tell, the disciples are telling Jesus this, and he talks to them. He doesn't talk to her, and says that he's supposed to be sent to the lost sheep of Israel. And then she comes and worships him. Okay, so she's using messianic language to describe him. She's persistent in following after him, and then she worships him, and says, "Lord, help me." And so she's all in. And then Jesus says about not good taking the children's bread and giving it to the little dogs. Well, the children, you think of the Jews and the bread, as we've talked about before, and then the little dogs. Hogs and dogs in Scripture are not good terms to be applied to you. Think about the casting the pearls before swine and giving what's holy to the dogs that we've already covered. Hogs and dogs are just not what you want to be called. And so talks about her as if she's a little dog. And then she comes back. And this is just amazing to me that she extends this illustration and says, "Yes, Lord, even the little dogs eat the crumbs which fall from the master's table." What faith? I mean, healing her daughter who's severely demon possessed and calling that crumbs, and yet knowing that God, Jesus in this case, that he can do something about that, and knowing that he is the master. Yeah. I don't even know what to say about that. Jesus is the master teacher, and he does this to draw out this great faith of this woman who's in such desperation, such pain over her own daughter, and yet he draws it out, and it shows her great faith. And here she is. She's not even a Jew.
Yeah.
And we think about everything we've talked about today, and the different levels of faith, and it's almost like Jesus does this. It's like here's his disciples, and they see it, and they're annoyed with her. They want him to urge him to send her away, and yet he uses this to show this great faith of this woman who's not even a Jew. Yeah. It's almost like he's pointing at her and saying, "This is something you can learn from."
Yeah, absolutely. And again, thematically in the book of Matthew, we notice here's another Gentile. And I think in thinking in those kind of terms, as far as Matthew's inclusion of this story and what it says in the context of everything else we're reading, is that not only do we see the faith of the Gentiles, but Jesus himself saying, here Matthew's reporting that Jesus' words are, "I came to Israel." And here's this woman saying, I know, I'll take whatever you give me. The condemnation of the nation of Israel from those words. What Jesus says about these other cities, ancient and modern in the context of the first century, but ancient and modern, who stand in judgment of Israel, that's brought to life in this woman. That if they saw what you see, well, here she is, and she sees it, and they don't. And so I think it's just driving that point home. Jesus is saying, I'm not even offering myself to the Gentiles. They're coming to me, and they're begging for it. And here's Israel overlooking it. And so I think that drives that point home even further. Well, we come to the end here. I think I said John's gospel earlier. I meant this is the story I was referring to, of course. And we come to the end here, and again we have a number of uh, a crowd coming near. It says Jesus departed from there, verse 29, and skirted the Sea of Galilee, and went up on the mountain and sat down there. And a great multitude came to him, having with them the lame, blind, mute, maimed, and many others. And they laid them down at Jesus' feet, and he healed them. So the multitudes marveled when they saw the mute speaking, the maimed made whole, the lame walking, the blind seeing, and they glorified the God of Israel. Now Jesus called his disciples to himself and said, I have compassion on the multitude, because they have now continued with me 3 days and have nothing to eat. And I do not want to send them away hungry, lest they faint on the way. And then his disciples said to him, what did they say, Garrett?
Well, they say, where will we get so many loaves in this desolate place to satisfy such a large crowd? So it's as if they had not learned anything from the previous story. And I think it just shows they still think in physical terms. Even though they've seen these miracles, they don't fully understand and realize what they're dealing with Jesus. And so Jesus feeds them with seven loaves and a few small fish. He gives thanks, and he broke it and started giving to the disciples. And again, they all ate and were satisfied. In this case, it's about 4,000 people, and they had 7 full baskets this time. So very similar to the feeding of the 5,000 here. And again, you're just disappointed in the disciples. They still don't understand who Jesus is fully.
Yeah. I mean, if truly they learn, then you expect their response to be, when he says he wants to feed them, then say, "Hey, we got it covered." But of course, and I think what this speaks to is, again, it's easy for us to say that. It's one thing to see a miracle. It's another to get to the point where you have the expectation. To get to the point where you're like, that's just who he is. That wasn't just some anomaly. It wasn't just some weird thing. This is the master of heaven and earth. This is the master over creation. And so to get to the point of having that confident response of, all right, here's some loaves and fishes. How would you like us to go about distributing this, or whatever the case may be, but having that faithful response. I also just point out here that even though there is this lack of faith, and it's illustrated time and time again, that we see the failures, as Jason was pointing out, they are learning from those failures. These are not men whose faith was growing weaker and weaker through these expressions of lack of faith, but rather they were growing stronger, and to the point that these are the men who are going to be at the very foundations of the church. And so be careful as we sort of roll our eyes at the apostles and wonder how they could be so foolish. They're growing, they're learning. And they are learning by seeing things, for us, this is literally ancient history. I mean, we've learned about these things all our lives, and we've had the advantage of learning about them being told in a historical context. But can you imagine experiencing them? I think we hardly can. We can hardly imagine seeing these things and trying to come to grips with that reality. What would you do if you saw that today? I'm going to tell you, I would immediately be skeptical. I would say there's some trick at play here. And we would be right to be skeptical, because these things don't happen. And so it takes time for that faith to grow. Jesus has enough patience to let that faith grow and to continue building it as they go along. And then ultimately has the confidence to put into their hands the spreading of the kingdom, as we see over in the book of Acts. Yeah, Jason.
I just wanted to add something to what Garrett was saying when he made the comment about the disciples didn't learn from the first feeding of the 5,000 and between this one. When Peter walked on the water, and Jesus, when they got in the boat from Matthew 14, From verse 32, it says, when they got into the boat, the wind stopped, and those who were in the boat worshiped him, saying, "You are certainly God's son." Well, now they get to the end of chapter 15 here, and they're going to feed the crowd again. Well, they just admitted that he was God's son, yet they still don't quite comprehend the power that he has. They saw him walk on the water. They saw Peter walk on the water, and then his faith shrank and he sank, and admitted, you are God's son, but they still just can't comprehend who he truly is yet.
Yes. Yeah. And so again, just building up to that recognition. Well, we will pick up in chapter 16, where we'll come back and visit that very thing, that very confession and understanding who Jesus is, and it gets very explicit about who he is in his conversation with his apostles. And so we look forward to studying that chapter together. Hope that you'll join us for that study. It will be this Wednesday night, and it will be streamed live, is my expectation. And so we'll be doing pre-recorded on the weekends, and then doing live Bible classes on Wednesday nights. And so we encourage you to invite. We encourage you to join in. They will also be recorded in addition to being streamed, and so you can watch those after the fact as well. Thanks again for joining us. Thank you guys for your participation, and we look forward to continuing our study together. Hope these are a blessing to you, and that God will bless you. Thank you.